The first thing I think that's very important to understand is that property is a concept. It doesn't have a true, what some people would refer to as a true, distinct individual reality. The property is an idea. It is conceptual in nature. It's a mental construct, if you will, of human beings. Um, in a very real sense, property doesn't really exist. Now, I don't want to wax too philosophical on this because that takes us in down a totally different rabbit hole. And these are rabbit holes that have fascinated me for a very long time, but perhaps they don't fit here with what we're going to talk about here today. But it's important to understand that it is a mental construct, that property doesn't really exist. It is a mental creation by human beings. Now, the second thing I think that's very important to understand is that this concept or this mental construct of what we call property starts with yourself. You see, the first form or the first idea of property comes into existence with oneself. We are born with a body and a being, and that being or that body um, has an existence or a life. And for periods during the human experience, that body or that being did not have property rights. That body or that being that lived supposedly inside of the body, and I do use those words purposefully, supposedly, that being that lived inside of the body, and it doesn't, but that's how most people understand it, did not belong to the individual. That your body or in the being that your body possessed were typically belonged to something else, to someone else, or to a clan or a group or a government or um, what have you. Uh, in the realm where the vast majority of human beings were basically slaves and lived under the direction and the domain of others, their bodies were not theirs. And the beings that possessed those bodies were not theirs. There was a movement in the human experience that began to grow in popularity, to grow in force and power. This movement was the movement of the individual. And this movement of going from a clan or a group or a slave-based system to an individual rights system, and this individual movement brought about a newer co- version of the concept of property. So property um, was largely, the concept of property was largely reserved for the privileged few because there were no individual rights. And devoid of individual rights, the property of the individual, even at the point of birth, belonged to a very small group of elites. A new movement, this new movement that emerged called for lack of a better phrase, the individual rights movement brought about a wider or a more expansive concept of property. And this wider, more expansive idea of property extended to individual rights. I have a body, and that body has rights. I have a being. I have existence. My existence deserves or has certain rights. My body has certain rights. And this movement into this broader, more expansive idea of the individual, which in itself is conceptual as well. Um, this new concept of the individual having an existence, and this existence of the individual having property rights because this individual has a body, started from there. Um, some might feel that this is not really connected to Bitcoin or your financial existence in any way, but it has every single thing to do with Bitcoin and your financial existence today, because what we call property today is nothing more than the extension of the core concept of property, which is I am. And this this concept that I exist, I am an individual, has created the further extension of the idea of property, where if I am, then what I have is an extension of I am, or who I am, or what I am, and that should be bestowed with the same rights that I have. And so I want you to see where I'm going with this, where the concept of property grows larger and larger from a central point of the individual. And so first, it's my body is my property. And then, well, wait a minute. Now my body has a farm. My body lives on a farm. Well, my farm is my property. And on this farm, my farm has cows, and my cows are my property. And so everything stems from this conceptual idea of the individual, right? So the individual is the first point of personal property, and then what is attached to the individual must be bestowed with the same rights as the individual. If I'm supposed to have control over my body and who I am, then what this body has should be bestowed with the same rights. And so there are, in this movement, there are certain factions and certain governments that have decided to honor that movement more than others. So if we take the United States as an example, property rights was far more important than other parts of the world or other governments, right, that were formed, where there are certain governments where they don't really truly respect the individual property right notion like another country like the United States. And therefore, anything that if the individual doesn't have rights, then anything they have doesn't have rights. The United States really is somewhat unique in this way, where they went further from a historical point of view than any other organized group of people ever in the history of humanity. They went further down the path of, well, the individual has rights. And therefore, what the individual has or possesses, those things are bestowed with the same rights. And so today, the United States has stronger property laws, property right laws, than most other regions in the world.